The great hall of Winterfell was filled with the warm glow of torches and the scent of roasted meat. Lords and ladies of the north feasted alongside their king, Robert Baratheon, who had ridden north with his knights and banners. Unlike the somber meeting that once took place when Robert came to name Eddard Stark as Hand of the King, this visit bore a different purpose: marriage. The moment Robert set eyes on Sansa Stark, he saw something familiar. She had the beauty of a noble woman, her auburn hair cascading down her shoulders, and those tully blue eyes that reminded him, in the faintest way, of Lyanna Stark. His old wounds, the ones that never truly healed, ached at the sight of her. But she was young, and her delicate face carried a softness that Lyanna had never possessed. Eddard Stark had initially refused the idea when Robert proposed it over a cup of wine. "She is but a girl," Ned had argued. "She is no more than 12. Robert, you are—" "A king," Robert cut in, his tone hardening, "and it's high time I had a wife who would bear me a true Baratheon son, not a lion cub from the rock." Ned had clenched his jaw, looking at his old friend with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. He knew what this meant. If Robert put aside Cersei, it would mean war with the Lannisters. Tywin Lannister would not sit idle while his daughter was cast away like a common whore, but Robert was determined. The man who once conquered the Seven Kingdoms did not fear Tywin Lannister, nor did he concern himself with the political consequences of his desires. The wedding was arranged swiftly, the ravens flew, and the North prepared for a royal celebration unlike any it had ever seen. The Stark banners waved proudly beside the golden stag of House Baratheon. The North had gained a queen. Sansa had spent her childhood dreaming of being queen, imagining a handsome prince who would sweep her away into a world of songs and splendor. But now, standing in the Godswood, her hand clasped in Robert's as they exchanged their vows, reality sank in. Robert was no prince. He was a man long past his prime, with a belly full of ale and a mind that drifted to memories of a dead woman. She had wanted a Joffrey, a charming, golden-haired prince who would adore her. Instead, she was wed to a king who barely looked at her unless he was drinking. After the wedding, the royal procession left Winterfell for King's Landing. The journey south was long, and for much of it, Sansa rode in silence, her direwolf, Lady padding beside her. She found comfort in her wolf, more than in the man who now called her his wife. When they arrived at the Red Keep, Cersei Lannister had already been dismissed from the court, sent back to Casterly Rock in disgrace. The moment she had received word that Robert was annulling their marriage, she had thrown a golden goblet across the chamber, her fury echoing through the halls. "You think I will go quietly?" she had snarled at Robert. "You may be king, but I am a lion." Robert had laughed in her face. A lion without teeth. Tywin Lannister had not taken the insult lightly. The moment Cersei returned to Casterly Rock, he began forging alliances, gathering gold and men, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Lannisters did not forget slights. Sansa entered a court that was already a battlefield in disguise. Varys whispered of growing unrest in the west. Peter Baelish, ever the opportunist, saw an opening. If he had once desired Sansa in the original timeline, it was nothing compared to now, when she was Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. At court, Sansa quickly realized she was alone. She had expected admiration and love, but the nobles whispered behind her back. The court had been dominated by Lannister influence for so long that many still remained loyal to them. Even Robert's own men muttered about his new bride being too much a northern girl. She found herself under the watchful eyes of the council, men who saw her as a pawn, but she was not the same naive girl who had once dreamed of being queen. She had learned from her mother that politics were as deadly as any battle, and so Sansa began listening. She watched how Varys moved through the court like a shadow, how Baelish smiled too easily. She observed how Renly Baratheon seemed eager to charm her, while Stannis Baratheon barely acknowledged her existence. She was young, but she was not blind. Robert, for his part, was distant. He spent his days drinking, and his nights reminiscing about Lyanna. Though he had won his war, he had lost the only woman he ever truly loved, and no marriage, not even to a beautiful young bride, could change that. While the Red Keep celebrated the new queen, the Westerlands prepared for war. Tywin Lannister was no fool. He had ruled Westeros in all but name during Aerys II's reign, and he had no intention of watching his family be cast aside like beggars. At Casterly Rock, he summoned his banners. Jaime Lannister, ever loyal to his family, sharpened his sword. Cersei, still seething, urged her father to act. "They humiliated me," she spat. "Him, that little northern girl, I will see them burn." Tywin remained calm. He was not a man who struck in anger. He struck when victory was assured. War must be won before the first blade is drawn," he mused. Ravens flew, gold changed hands, whispers spread through the kingdoms. Soon, Westeros would learn that Robert Baratheon's decision to cast aside a lioness would cost him more than he could ever imagine. Sansa Stark sat on the edge of her bed in the royal chambers of the Red Keep, staring at the golden embroidery of the bedspread. The reality of her new life was settling in, heavier than the crown on her head. She was queen of the Seven Kingdoms, but she felt more like a prisoner. Robert rarely visited her chambers. When he did, he was usually reeking of wine, muttering Lyanna's name under his breath. The first time it had happened, Sansa had swallowed the lump in her throat and pretended not to hear. The second time, she realized she had no choice but to endure it. She missed her family. She missed her mother's warm hands brushing through her hair, Arya's wild laughter, even the cold distance of her father when he was lost in thought. She longed for the snowy halls of Winterfell, where the air smelled of pine, and the wind carried the howls of direwolves. But she could not go. And back, she was trapped in King's Landing, in a court that whispered behind her back and smiled to her face. Sansa soon learned that King's Landing was more dangerous than any battlefield. At least in war, you saw the enemy coming with swords drawn. Here they struck with words, with poisoned cups, with smiling daggers hidden beneath silken sleeves. The first to approach her was Petyr Baelish. "Your Grace," he said smoothly, bowing low before her, "the court is still adjusting to your presence. Change is difficult for some to accept." Sansa kept her face neutral, but she had learned enough to know that Littlefinger never did anything without an agenda. "I am their queen," she replied, lifting her chin. "They will learn to accept it." Baelish smiled, as if amused by her attempt at confidence. "Of course, but a queen must have allies, no?" Sansa did not answer. She knew what he wanted, what he always wanted: control, power, influence. She would not give it to him so easily. The second visitor was Varys. Unlike Baelish, he did not try to charm her. He merely observed. "I have known many queens," he said one evening when they found themselves alone in the gardens. "Some ruled with kindness, others with fear. Few survived long." "Which am I?" Sansa asked, testing him. Varys smiled thinly. "That, Your Grace, remains to be seen." While Sansa struggled to find her place at court, Robert was facing his own demons. The moment he had sent Cersei back to Casterly Rock, he had expected Tywin to retaliate. What he did not expect was the silence. The lack of response unsettled him more than an open war would have. Tywin Lannister was not a man who took insults lightly. He did not rage or curse like some lesser lords. He planned. Robert was no fool. He had been a warrior all his life, but war was fought differently in the shadows of King's Landing. He could feel it creeping closer, lurking just beyond his reach. And so, he drank. More than usual. He took solace in hunting, in tournaments, in anything that would distract him from the growing sense of unease in his gut. Eddard Stark, still serving as Hand of the King, noticed. "You drink too much," Ned told him one evening as they sat in the council chambers. "I've always drunk too much," Robert shot back, pouring himself another goblet of wine. Ned frowned. "The Lannisters are waiting. They will not strike first, but when they do, it will be on their terms." Robert slammed his cup down. "Then let them come. I won my crown on the battlefield once before, and I'll do it again if I have to." But war would not come with banners and swords just yet. It would come in whispers, in betrayal, in gold, and Sansa was right in the middle of it. At Casterly Rock, Tywin Lannister sat in his solar, reading the latest Raven from King's Landing. His expression remained unreadable, but Cersei watched him closely, her nails digging into her palms. "Well?" she demanded. Tywin set the letter down. "The court is divided. Robert drinks himself into oblivion. The girl is unprotected." Cersei's lips curled in satisfaction. "Then we strike!" Tywin gave her a look, sharp and cold. "We do not strike like common rebels. We dismantle, we undermine. Robert Baratheon will not die in battle. He will fall by his own weakness." His plan was already in motion. Gold had exchanged hands in the shadows of Flea Bottom. Lords had been bought, allies had been won, and the first move was already being played. That very night, a northern knight loyal to House Stark was found dead in the streets of King's Landing. His throat was slit, his coin purse untouched. A warning, a message. Winter was coming, but it was not the cold Sansa needed to fear. It was the lion. The halls of the Red Keep were never silent. Even at night, there were whispers carried by the cold winds that blew in from Blackwater Bay. Sansa lay in her bed, wide awake, listening to the distant sounds of footsteps, muffled, voices, and the crackling of torches in the corridors. The murder of Ser Willem, one of her father's most trusted knights, had sent a chill through the castle. He had been a loyal man, a northerner, and now he was dead. His body dumped in the streets like a common beggar. Robert had brushed it, off as nothing more than a drunken brawl. But Eddard Stark knew better. So did Sansa. She had seen the way the court had changed in recent weeks. There were fewer smiles now, more hushed conversations, more eyes watching her as she walked through the halls. She had once imagined that being queen meant power, respect, love. But here, in King's Landing, it meant being a target. And she was beginning to realize just how alone she truly was. One evening, as she sat in her solar, a soft knock came at the door. She turned, expecting one of her ladies-in-waiting, but instead it was Lord Varys. He stepped inside, his silken robes whispering against the floor. "Your Grace," he said with a low bow, "might I have a word?" Sansa nodded, keeping her back straight, though her hands trembled in her lap. Varys moved closer, his expression unreadable. "You are in danger." Sansa's breath caught. "The Lannisters. Do not forget their enemies," he continued, his voice low. "And though you are young, you are not invisible to them. Tywin Lannister does not act on impulse. He acts when he is certain of victory." Sansa swallowed hard. "What do they want?" Varys tilted his head. "They want their power restored. They want to humiliate Robert as he humiliated Cersei. And above all, they want you gone." She clenched her fists in her lap. "Gone?" Varys sighed. "There are many ways to remove a queen. Some are quick, some are slow, some involve poison in a goblet, others a simple accident." Sansa felt the room grow colder. "But I do not wish to see harm come to you, Your Grace," Varys said, offering a small, calculated smile. "You remind me of another young girl, once trapped in a nest of vipers." Sansa narrowed her eyes. "And what happened to her?" Varys met her gaze evenly. She learned to bite back. While Sansa feared for her life in the shadows, Robert was too consumed by his own demons to notice. He spent more and more time drinking, hunting, and reminiscing about the past. Eddard had tried to reason with him, tried to warn him that the Lannisters would not stay idle forever, but Robert was too stubborn to listen. "I crushed them in war once, and I'll do it again if need be," he grumbled one night, slamming his goblet onto the table. Ned clenched his jaw. "Tywin does not fight wars on battlefields, Robert. He fights them in coin, in whispers, in poisoned alliances." Robert scoffed. "Let him whisper all he likes. I have the throne." But even a king could bleed. It happened just days later. A northern servant, a woman who had served House Stark for years, was found dead in the lower levels of the castle. Strangled. There was no thief, no robbery, just a message. "The wolves are not welcome in the lion's den." Eddard Stark went pale when he saw the body. He turned to Robert, furious. "This is not a coincidence," he growled. "The Lannisters are making their move." Robert clenched his fists. "Then let them come. I am not afraid of Tywin Lannister." But Sansa knew better. Tywin was not coming with swords drawn. He was coming in silence, in the darkness, and she was next. The walls of the Red Keep felt smaller with each passing day. Sansa had once thought them grand, a castle fit for a queen. Now they felt like a cage, and she was the little bird trapped within it. The murders of Sir Willem and the Stark servant had sent a clear message. She was not safe. Every time she stepped into court, she felt eyes on her, watching, waiting. The Lannisters did not need swords to strike. They used gold, whispers, and fear. And worst of all, Robert did nothing. Her husband was too blind, too drunk, too wrapped in his own misery to see the dangers that lurked around them. Sansa had always dreamed of marrying a king, but she had never imagined she would marry a man who no longer wanted to rule. And so, she turned to the only man who might help her. Peter Baelish found her alone in the royal gardens, standing near the fountain as the cool water trickled down the marble edges. "Your Grace," he greeted, bowing low. "You look troubled." Sansa did not answer at first. She had learned not to trust Littlefinger, but she also knew he was powerful. He was not a man of honor, but he was a man who knew how to survive. "You served my mother once," she said at last, her voice quiet. Baelish smiled, tilting his head. "I did, and I would have done anything for her." Sansa turned to face him. "Then serve me." His smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. "And what is it you desire, my queen?" Sansa hesitated. She did not want to say the words, but she knew she must. "I want to live. I want to be safe." Baelish studied her for a long moment before stepping closer. "Safety, my dear, is an illusion, but power, now that is real." Sansa frowned. "I do not want power." Littlefinger chuckled softly. "No, not yet, but you will. And when that day comes, I hope you remember who offered you his hand first." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "King Robert is failing. And when he falls, this city will devour those too weak to stand on their own. Choose your allies. Wisely, my queen. The lions are watching." And with that he walked away, leaving Sansa standing alone by the fountain, her heart pounding. That night, another raven arrived from Casterly Rock. Tywin Lannister was moving. Eddard Stark read the letter in silence, his jaw tightening as he realized what it meant. Tywin had sent envoys to the Reach, to Dorne, even to the Iron Islands. He was gathering support, weaving a web that would strangle King's Landing from within. Ned turned to Robert, shoving the parchment into his hands. "They are building alliances. We must act." Robert barely glanced at the letter before tossing it aside. "Let them. They are nothing without their gold." Ned slammed his fist on the table. "By the time you realize what they have done, it will be too late." But Robert only reached for his wine. "I won't march against ghosts, Ned. When Tywin makes his move, then I'll crush him." But Tywin Lannister did not make mistakes, and he had already made his move. The feast was grand, the great hall filled with laughter, music, and flowing wine. It was meant to be a celebration, though Sansa had no idea what they were celebrating. Robert drank deeply, roaring with laughter as he slapped Renly on the back. His face was red, his speech slurred, but that was nothing new. He had been drinking more than ever in recent days. Sansa barely touched her food. She could not shake the feeling of unease that sat heavy in her stomach. Then Robert coughed. At first, no one paid it any mind. Then he coughed again, harder this time. His goblet slipped from his fingers, wine spilling across the table. Silence fell over the hall. Robert lurched forward, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with panic. His hands clawed at his throat as he toppled from his chair, his body hitting the stone floor with a sickening thud. Screams erupted. The king was convulsing, his mouth foaming, his face turning a horrible shade of purple. Sansa's blood ran cold. The king was dying, and the lion had finally struck. The great hall of the Red Keep was in chaos. Lords and ladies rose from their seats, their voices a cacophony of fear and confusion. The king, Robert Baratheon, the usurper, the conqueror, lay on the cold stone floor, his body twitching violently as foam bubbled from his lips. Sansa was frozen in place, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She saw Sir Barristan Selmy rush forward, shouting for the Maesters. Renly Baratheon was on his knees beside his brother, shaking him, pleading. "Get the Maester!" someone yelled. "Help the king!" But Sansa knew. She saw it in the way Robert's fingers twitched, in the way his eyes rolled back into his skull. This was not an accident, this was murder. This was the Lannisters. She turned her head and met Lord Varys's gaze across the room. His face remained unreadable, but his eyes told her everything. The spider had known this was coming. He had tried to warn her. She looked to the high table where the small council sat. Pater Baelish watched the scene with mild interest, as if he were witnessing a play rather than a man's death. Grand Maester Pycelle was already shuffling forward, too slow, too late. And then there was Stannis. The eldest of Robert's brothers stood still, his face a mask of stone, but his fingers curled into fists at his sides. He knew, too. The Maesters came, but it did not matter. Robert Baratheon's body stopped moving minutes later, his last breath escaping his lips in a rattling gasp. Silence fell over the great hall. The king was dead. Sansa felt the weight of 1,000 eyes turned toward her. She was the queen now, and she was alone. Renly was the first to break the silence. He turned to the gathered lords, his face pale, but determined. "We must act quickly," he said, his voice shaking. "The kingdom must not fall into chaos." Lord Varys stepped forward. "Yes, we must ensure a smooth transition of power." But the question remained. Who would take the throne? Robert had no true-born children. His bastard sons and daughters were scattered, unacknowledged. By law, the throne should pass to Stannis, the next eldest Baratheon. But Renly had already begun gathering support for his own claim. And then there was Sansa. She was Robert's wife, his queen. Could she claim the throne for herself? Would the lords of the realm accept a northern girl as their ruler? She knew the answer before she even asked the question. No, they would never accept her. She was not Cersei Lannister, who had spent years weaving herself into the politics of the court. She was still an outsider, still a child in their eyes. And worst of all, she was surrounded by enemies. That night, as Robert's body was prepared for burial, ravens flew from King's Landing. Messages carried across the realm, announcing the king's death. And in the Westerlands, Tywin Lannister smiled. His plan had worked. Robert was dead, and the power struggle would begin. The Baratheon brothers would fight among themselves, and when the dust settled, the Lannisters would still be standing. Cersei had been sent back to Casterly Rock, but that did not mean she had been idle. She had secured alliances, she had bought men, and now she was ready to return. The next day, as the city of King's Landing mourned its king, a golden lion banner was raised over the Red Keep. Cersei Lannister was coming home, and Sansa Stark was running out of time. The bells of King's Landing tolled in mourning, their solemn echoes carried through the crowded streets. The city wept for its king, or so the small folk whispered. In truth, many celebrated in the shadows. Robert Baratheon had been no beloved ruler. His reign was marked by excess, neglect, and a court rife with corruption. But for Sansa Stark, the king's death was not a relief. It was a death sentence. She had spent the past few days locked, away in her chambers, awaiting the inevitable. The city outside her window stirred with tension, the air thick with uncertainty. Robert's death had left a power vacuum, and in Westeros, such voids were always filled with blood. Then the banners changed. Sansa had been watching from her balcony when she saw them, golden lions rising over the Red Keep. The stag of House Baratheon was being torn down, its reign over the capital coming to an abrupt end. She knew what it meant. Cersei Lannister was back. Sansa was summoned to the throne room that afternoon. When she entered, she found the chamber packed with lords and ladies, their expressions carefully masked. The Iron Throne loomed before her, and seated upon its jagged edges was Cersei herself. The Queen Dowager was dressed in black, a picture of mourning, but her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Beside her stood Jaime Lannister, his golden armor catching the torchlight. "Your Grace," Cersei purred as Sansa approached. "You look unwell. Grief does not suit you." Sansa kept her chin high, though her heart pounded. "I mourn my husband," she said evenly, "as should you." Cersei's smile did not reach her eyes. "Oh, I do. Robert was a great man." She tilted her head, studying Sansa like a cat watching a mouse. But the realm must move forward. A new king must take the throne. Sansa swallowed hard. The rightful heir is Stannis Baratheon. Murmurs rippled through the court, but Cersei merely chuckled. "Stannis?" she said with mock amusement. "My dear, do you truly believe the lords of Westeros will rally behind that humorless, rigid man? No, the people will follow a king they love." Sansa already knew what she would say next. "My son," Cersei continued, her voice smooth as silk. "Joffrey Baratheon will take the throne." A cold dread crept through Sansa's veins. Joffrey. She had never met him, but she had once dreamed of being his queen. That was before she had married Robert, before she had seen what kind of world she lived in. Now the idea of Joffrey sitting the throne filled her with horror. She opened her mouth to protest, but a hand closed around her wrist. Littlefinger. Petter Baelish leaned in slightly, just enough for her to hear. "Do not fight her here," he whispered. "Not yet." Sansa bit her lip and lowered her gaze. Cersei smiled in victory. "Good girl," she murmured. The days that followed were a blur. Joffrey was crowned king in a grand ceremony, and though the court cheered, Sansa saw the cracks beneath the surface. Stannis had not responded. Renly had vanished from the capital. The Baratheon brothers would not let this stand. War was coming, and Sansa, she was trapped. She had no allies. Ned Stark had left the capital days ago, returning to Winterfell before Robert's death. Her father had wanted no part in the coming storm, and he had pleaded with Robert to send Sansa north as well. But Robert had refused, and now with him dead, she was exactly where Cersei wanted her, alone, vulnerable, and at her mercy. One evening, as Sansa walked the halls of the Red Keep, she heard laughter ahead. Peering around the corner, she caught a glimpse of Joffrey. The boy king stood with his mother and Jaime, a cruel smirk on his lips. He was no longer the sweet prince from her childhood fantasies. He was a lion cub raised on poison, his mother's malice burning in his veins. And he was looking at her. Sansa turned away quickly, her pulse racing. She could feel the trap closing around her. She had once dreamed of being queen. Now she only dreamed of escape. Sansa had never felt more like a prisoner. She still wore her crown, still sat beside Joffrey during feasts, still walked through the halls of the Red Keep with ladies trailing behind her. But none of it mattered. She had no power, no voice. She was a queen in name only, an ornament for the court, a puppet for Cersei's schemes. She was watched wherever she went. The moment Robert died, her northern guards had been dismissed, replaced by men who answered only to the Queen Dowager. Even her own handmaidens whispered behind her back she was alone, and Joffrey was growing crueler by the day. Sansa had once dreamed of Joffrey as a golden prince, the perfect husband from the stories. But when she saw him now, truly saw him, she realized what he was, a monster. At court he carried himself like a ruler, barking orders, sneering at his lords. But behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. He took pleasure in making people squirm. He humiliated lords who had once laughed at his childish temper, forced them to bow lower than necessary, to apologize for slights they had never committed. And he had set his sights on her. It started small, little comments at court, mocking her northern ways, her father's supposed weakness. But then his cruelty became sharper, more pointed. One evening during a feast, Joffrey called for her to stand before the gathered lords. "My lady wife," he announced, his voice dripping with false sweetness, "you do not smile enough. A queen should be joyful, don't you think?" Sansa felt the heat of 100 eyes on her. I am joyful, Your Grace." Joffrey's smirk widened. "Then prove it." He turned to Sir Meryn Trant, one of his Kingsguard. "Sir Meryn, perhaps our queen needs a lesson in obedience." Sansa's stomach twisted in fear. Sir Meryn stepped forward, reaching for his sword, but before he could move, another voice rang out, "Enough!" The room fell silent as Jaime Lannister rose from his seat, his golden armor gleaming in the torchlight. He fixed Joffrey with a sharp, cold gaze. "She is your queen, not your toy. Show some dignity." For a moment, Sansa thought Joffrey would defy him, but then the boy king clenched his jaw and waved a dismissive hand. "Very well," he muttered. "The lesson can wait." Sansa let out a quiet breath of relief, but she knew this was only the beginning. That night, as she lay awake in her chambers, a figure slipped into the room. Sansa gasped, sitting upright. "Who?" "Shh!" Pater Baelish stepped from the shadows, his eyes glinting in the dim candlelight. "You are in danger," he whispered. Sansa swallowed hard. "I know." Baelish tilted his head. "Then you must act. Joffrey will not stop. Cersei will not let you go. If you stay here, you will die in this castle. Whether it takes months or years, they will destroy you piece by piece." Sansa's throat tightened. "What can I do?" Littlefinger smiled. "Let me take you away from this place." Sansa hesitated. She knew what kind of man he was. He had betrayed her father once before, and he would not hesitate to betray her if it suited him. But what choice did she have? She met his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "When?" Baelish's smile widened. "Soon." Over the next few days, Sansa waited in silence, playing the role of the obedient queen while fear gnawed at her insides. She knew Cersei was watching. She knew Joffrey was waiting for the moment he could break her. And she knew she could not fail. Littlefinger's plan was simple. A ship awaited in the Blackwater, its crew loyal only to him. On the night of the next feast, while the court was distracted, she would slip away in disguise. But nothing in King's Landing was ever simple, for as Sansa planned her escape, Cersei Lannister was already making her own move. And when the night of the feast arrived, the trap was sprung. The night of the feast arrived with laughter and music filling the great hall. Torches flickered along the stone walls, casting long shadows over the assembled lords and ladies. The scent of roasted boar and spiced wine thickened the air, masking the danger that lurked beneath the surface. Sansa sat beside Joffrey, her hands resting in her lap, her face carefully blank. She had learned long ago not to let her emotions show. Tonight was her only chance to escape. She could feel it, the weight of the plan pressing against her like a tightening noose. She had memorized every step, every corridor she needed to take. She would slip away during the feast, dressed as a servant, and make her way to the docks, where Baelish's ship waited. But something felt wrong. She saw it in the way Cersei watched her. The Queen Dowager sat across the room, clad in black silk, her goblet held lightly in her fingers. Her green eyes flicked to Sansa every so often, the faintest smile playing on her lips. It was a knowing smile. Sansa's stomach twisted. She knows. Sansa rose carefully, her heart pounding against her ribs. "If it pleases your grace, I should like some air." Joffrey barely glanced at her, too busy laughing at something one of his lords had said. He waved her away with a lazy hand. Sansa turned, stepping lightly down from the high table. She walked as calmly as she could, her pulse racing with every step. She could feel the eyes of the court on her, but she kept her chin high, forcing herself to appear composed. The moment she stepped beyond the doors of the great hall, she picked up her pace. The hallways were dimly lit, the torches sputtering in the drafts. Her slippered feet made no sound against the cold stone floor as she hurried through the passages, her heart hammering. She was almost there. The hidden servants' tunnel was just ahead. If she could reach it, she could slip out into the city. Unseen! Then she turned a corner and stopped short. Sir Meryn Trant stood before her, flanked by two gold-cloaked guards. Sansa's breath caught in her throat. "You're not going anywhere, Your Grace," Sir Meryn sneered. Moments later, Sansa was dragged back into the throne room. The feast had fallen silent. The lords and ladies stared as she was shoved forward, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. Joffrey turned, his brows knitting in confusion. "What's this?" Cersei rose from her seat, her lips curving into a cold smile. "It seems," she said lightly, "that our dear queen was attempting to flee the capital." The murmur of the court was like a rising tide, growing louder with every second. Sansa forced herself to lift her chin. "I was not running," she lied, her voice steadier than she felt. Cersei let out a soft chuckle. "Oh, my sweet girl," she murmured, stepping forward. She reached out and brushed a lock of Sansa's auburn hair back behind her ear. "You should know by now. Nothing happens in this city without my knowledge." Sansa swallowed hard, her skin prickling where Cersei had touched her. "She is a traitor," Sir Meryn announced, his voice echoing through the hall. "She meant to abandon her king." Joffrey shot to his feet, his face contorted with rage. "You dare betray me?" he shrieked. Sansa trembled. "I would never—" "Liar!" Joffrey bellowed. He turned to his guards. "Take her to the dungeons. Let her rot." A fresh wave of gasps rippled through the court. Sansa paled. "No, please." Before she could say another word, rough hands seized her arms. As she was dragged from the hall, she caught one last glimpse of Cersei, still smiling, still watching. The lioness had won. The dungeon was cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of mold and stale water. Sansa sat on the stone floor, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. The reality of her situation pressed down on her like a weight. She had failed. She had come so close to escaping, but Cersei had outmaneuvered her. What would happen now? Would they keep her locked away until she withered in the dark? Would they force her into another marriage, using her as a pawn in their endless game? Or would Joffrey decide her fate with the same cruelty he had shown to others? She did not know, but she did know one thing. She was not the same girl who had once dreamed of knights and songs. If she was to survive this, she could no longer be the little bird who waited for someone to save her. She had to save herself.